On the night of September 15, 1940, numbers emerged that shook Air Chief Marshal Charles Pottle to his core. Bomber Command had sent 180 aircraft to strike the critical armament factories in Essen, the beating industrial heart of Hitler's war effort. However, 3 days later, reconnaissance photos painted a grim picture. Fewer than 5 out of every 100 aircraft had dropped their bombs within 5 miles of the intended target. The rest had scattered their bombs across the rural countryside, far from the munitions factories they were meant to destroy. Pottle stared at those aerial images, growing increasingly frustrated. He knew that Britain's entire strategic bombing doctrine was built on fragile, collapsing foundations. The problem wasn't a lack of bravery or training. The IAF crews were flying with incredible courage, navigating flat corridors and fighter screens with exceptional skill. The real issue lay in the outdated navigation technology. Bomber crews were still relying on techniques from the past, dead reckoning, map reading, and celestial navigation, methods borrowed from maritime traditions. But in the skies over blackout Germany, with searchlights blinding their night vision and anti-aircraft fire forcing evasive maneuvers, pilots were essentially flying blind. Industrial smoke blocked out landmarks, and clouds rendered maps irrelevant. Winds aloft pushed the aircraft off course, often by miles, without the crews even realizing until bombs had already fallen on empty fields or residential neighborhoods, far from military targets. The results were no better in 1941 during operations against Cologne. Post-raid analysis showed bombs spread over a 40-mile radius, with entire bomber streams missing German cities altogether. Crews believed they were hitting the target zone, but instead, they were devastating rural villages with no strategic value other than agriculture. The exchange rate between tonnage dropped and actual damage inflicted showed an unsustainable trade-off. Britain was losing aircraft, crews, and ordnance while German war production went on unabated. In February 1942, Air Marshal Arthur Harris took over as Bomber Command Chief, inheriting this crisis. Harris was unwavering in his belief in the potential of strategic bombing, but even his optimism couldn't ignore the harsh reality of the numbers. Without a solution to the navigation problem, the very foundation of Bomber Command's operations was under threat. The answer lay in creating a specialized unit within the force, crews who would lead the way, identify targets using advanced navigation aids, and mark them for subsequent waves. This concept wasn't entirely new. The Germans had used a form of pathfinding during the Blitz, with planes equipped with X-jet radio beams to accurately mark British cities. The RAF had studied these methods and saw the value in precision targeting. In 1941, Group Captain Sidney Bufton pushed the idea of a Pathfinder Force, suggesting that consolidating the best navigators and bomb aimers into elite squadrons could greatly enhance the effectiveness of Bomber Command's operations. His ideas were met with resistance. Squadron leaders resented the loss of their best crews, and many senior officers feared that creating a special Pathfinder group would harm morale by creating perceived hierarchies within the force. Even Harris initially opposed the idea, arguing that all crews should be trained to the same high standards, rather than acknowledging varying skill levels. However, the failure of operations and growing political pressure eventually made the case undeniable. On August 11th, 1942, the Air Ministry officially established the Pathfinder Force. Command of the unit went to 32-year-old Australian Donald Bennett, a legendary aviator with an extensive knowledge of navigation and a passion for precision. Bennett viewed his appointment with intense commitment, certain that a scientific approach and rigorous training could transform the bombing campaigns from scattershot to precise and efficient operations. Bennett's vision went beyond simply finding targets. He aimed to mark them so precisely that even less experienced crews could hit them with far greater accuracy. Bennett began assembling his elite force by drawing personnel from across Bomber Command. Despite continued resistance from group commanders unwilling to lose their best crews, 3 squadrons, 735, 8356, and 109, were designated as Pathfinders. These squadrons would carry specialized equipment, undergo additional training, and be responsible for the success or failure of major bombing operations. However, the required equipment didn't exist in August 1942. RAF flares were designed for emergency illumination or photographic reconnaissance, not for guiding bombers through smoke and confusion. They were simple magnesium flares, burning white and descending slowly under parachutes. These lacked the visibility, color differentiation, and burn duration needed for precision marking. Bennett required something entirely different. He needed target indicators that were bright enough to stand out against city fires, with distinct colors for tactical communication, and engineered to pinpoint exact aiming locations rather than general areas. The task of creating these new target indicators went to Imperial Chemical Industries, whose pyrochemicals division faced significant technical challenges. The new Pathfinder target indicators had to withstand release from 20,000 feet, endure the shock of ignition at temperatures as low as -40 degrees Celsius, burn intensely for at least 3 minutes, and produce colors vivid enough to cut through industrial smoke. The formulation of target indicators required balancing conflicting demands. Magnesium was used for brightness, strontium compound for red, barium salts for green, and sodium for yellow, all while ensuring stable combustion under extreme conditions. ICI chemists developed a 50-pound target indicator canister, packed with pyrotechnic stars arranged around a central explosive charge. A barometric fuse detected the altitude drop upon release, triggering an ejection mechanism that scattered dozens of individual stars over a wide area. Each star was a compressed pellet of metallic salts and oxidizers, designed to burn at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius. The red variant used strontium carbonate and strontium nitrate, producing a deep crimson wavelength of approximately 620 nanometers, visible even through substantial smoke. Green indicators employed barium chlorate, emitting light around 530 nanometers in the yellow-green spectrum. Yellow markers use sodium compounds, emitting light at 590 nanometers, recognizable to any crew. The colors were not for aesthetic purposes but for tactical communication. Bennett developed a color coding system where specific colors conveyed instructions to following bomber streams. Red indicators marked primary aiming points, such as factory complexes, railway yards, or specific industrial facilities identified in pre-operation briefings. Green markers signaled alternate aiming points when primary markers were obscured by clouds or smoke. Yellow indicators indicated correction points, guiding crews to adjust their aim at specified distances from the marker. This color-coded system allowed complex tactical adjustments without relying on radio communication, which could be intercepted by German listening posts. The descent of the target indicators created distinctive patterns that crews quickly learned to interpret. When released from optimal altitude of 15,000 to 20,000 feet, the canisters briefly tumbled before firing the ejection charge, scattering stars in a circular pattern roughly 200 yards in diameter. The stars ignited simultaneously as they fell, each descending under a small parachute at a rate of about 15 feet per second. This created the appearance of colored rain frozen in midair, with dozens of brilliant points forming constellations in the darkness, marking precise coordinates on the ground. Pathfinder crews carried multiple types of target indicators for flexibility during operations. A typical Lancaster might carry 4 red indicators, 2 green, and 1 yellow, along with conventional high-explosive and incendiary bombs. The bomb aimer controlled the release through the standard sight, treating target indicators as precision ordnance, requiring perfect timing and positioning. Unlike area bombing, where near misses could still contribute to general destruction, Pathfinder marking demanded pinpoint accuracy. A target indicator released 300 yards off target could misdirect the entire bomber stream. As operations became more complex, the duration of the target indicators became critical. Early indicators burned out within 90 seconds, sufficient for small raids but inadequate for larger missions involving thousands of bombers. ICI developed longer-burning variants using slower combustion formulations, extending the burn time to 4 or 5 minutes. These extended durations allowed continuous marking during long attacks, though their reduced brilliance sometimes made them harder to identify amidst accumulating smoke. The Germans quickly recognized the tactical value of target indicators, leading to strict security measures. Manufacturing details were classified at the highest levels, and storage facilities were guarded. Each canister was serialized and tracked to prevent espionage or sabotage. Bennett was obsessed with reliability. A single failed target indicator during a critical operation could leave hundreds of bombers without guidance over heavily defended targets. Quality control procedures were rigorous, with random testing to verify ignition reliability and color consistency. Bennett's marking methodology evolved through intense trial and error during late 1942. Each operation revealed new complexities in illuminating targets for following bomber streams. The technique that emerged, known as the Newhaven Method, was named after the Sussex coastal town where Bennett refined the procedures. This method transformed pathfinding from an experimental process into a carefully choreographed operation. The method divided the Pathfinder Force into distinct waves, each arriving at calculated intervals with specific tasks that built marking accuracy through redundancy. The first wave consisted of illuminators, typically 8 to 12 Lancasters carrying photo flash bombs and high-capacity magnesium flares instead of target indicators. These crews arrived 3 minutes before the primary markers, their job to bathe the target area in brilliant white light, transforming the blackout landscape into temporary daylight. The flares, each producing 2 million candle power, descended under parachutes and created illumination lasting about 3 minutes. Under this artificial moonlight, landmarks became visible, river bends, railway junctions, and unique building configurations, which navigators had memoized from reconnaissance photos during briefings. The illuminators dropped their photo flashes simultaneously, creating brief bursts of intense light that allowed bomb aimers to capture mental images of the geography below. Primary markers followed precisely on schedule, arriving while the illumination remained optimal. These crews represented the absolute elite of Pathfinder forces, navigators and bomb aimers chosen for their exceptional accuracy. Each primary marker Lancaster carried only red target indicators, with orders to place them directly on target. The primary markers aimed to strike the exact designated point as outlined in operation orders. Bomb aimers had studied target photographs so thoroughly that they could sketch the area's distinctive features from memory. They knew they might only have seconds of clear visibility before their markers began to obscure ground details with colored light and smoke. The pivotal moment came when bomb aimers pressed the release mechanisms. Red stars tumbled to the ground, igniting into brilliant crimson constellations that marked the precise coordinates for the main force crews. Primary markers focused on achieving a tight concentration, ideally placing all their indicators within a 200-yard circle. This precision transformed abstract map coordinates into visible targets that crews arriving minutes later could identify instantly, even with limited navigation tools or poor visibility. The backup crews formed the third wave, arriving at 2-minute intervals throughout the operation. Their role addressed a common issue: target indicators burning out, smoke obscuring initial markers, and German firefighting efforts sometimes extinguishing markers before the main force could complete their bombing. Backup crews carried mixed loads of red and green target indicators, with instructions based on what they observed upon arrival. If the primary red markers were still visible and correctly placed, backers up would add fresh red indicators directly onto the existing concentration, ensuring consistent marking throughout the operation. If smoke had obscured the initial markers, backers up might drop green indicators at calculated offsets, guiding following bombers to adjust their aim accordingly. The timing of these intervals reflected careful calculation, balancing smoke dispersion rates, burn times, and bomber stream arrival patterns. Bennett's team analyzed numerous operations to measure how quickly smoke from early bombs would obscure the ground markers. They determined that 2-minute intervals provided the optimal balance, frequent enough to maintain continuous marking but spaced sufficiently for each backup crew to encounter reasonably clear conditions rather than relying on guesswork through the smoke. Main force crews were given explicit instructions during their briefings on which markers to attack. The simplest directive was to bomb the reds, meaning to aim directly at the densest concentration of red indicators visible upon arrival. More complex operations might instruct bombers to target green indicators 100 yards north or, if reds were obscured, to target yellows with a 200-yard offset to the east. This color-coded system offered tactical flexibility without needing radio communication, which could be intercepted by German defenses. The sophistication of the Newhaven method became clear with its built-in error correction. If primary markers misjudged the target, a genuine risk given navigation limitations, backers up could assess the situation and drop offset markers to indicate corrections. For example, if a backup crew noticed that initial red markers had fallen on residential areas instead of the intended factory complex, they might drop green markers on the correct target, trusting the following bombers to recognize and adjust to the new tactical direction. This adaptive capability transformed pathfinding from rigid pre-planning into flexible battlefield coordination. German civilians in shelters beneath Hamburg, Cologne, and Berlin developed their own term for the terror descending from above. They called the cascading colored lights Chrisma or Christmas trees, a name that combined or with dread. The metaphor captured the essence of the Pathfinder phenomenon. The spectacle of hundreds of colored stars falling through the night sky, arranged in glowing patterns that resembled festive decorations, was almost beautiful, until the deafening bombs followed moments later. This visual phenomenon was unlike anything seen in warfare before. When a full Pathfinder operation unfolded over a German city, the sequence became a spectacle visible from up to 50 miles away. First came the intense white glare of illuminator flares, transforming the night into an artificial day that illuminated every building. Then the primary red markers began their descent. Dozens of crimson stars appeared at high altitude, falling slowly under their parachutes. Each star burned with such intensity that it cast distinct shadows on the streets below, creating a surreal landscape of conflicting shadow angles as the stars moved relative to one another. As backers up added their markers, the display grew more complex. Greens joined the reds, their yellow-tinted glow contrasting with the deeper crimson, while yellow markers punctuated the pattern with their bright sodium emission. The varying descent rates of the markers, some falling faster than others due to parachute differences or wind conditions, created the tiered effect that inspired the Christmas tree analogy. Upper tiers glowed high above, middle tiers hung at intermediate heights, and lower tiers near the ground. All burned simultaneously in a vertical column of colored fire. The psychological impact on civilians below was profound and contradictory. Shelter wardens reported that people stood transfixed by the spectacle, even though air raid protocols instructed them to take cover. The human mind struggled to reconcile the beauty of the markers with the knowledge that they signaled imminent destruction. Children who survived the raids carried vivid memories of the colors for decades, describing them with a clarity usually reserved for traumatic events. The Christmas tree metaphor captured this psychological split. It invoked images of holiday warmth and family traditions while simultaneously describing a mechanism of death falling from the sky. German propaganda made extensive use of the Christmas tree imagery, though their messaging evolved throughout the war. Early broadcasts depicted British bombers as symbols of barbarism, describing them as terror flyers mocking Christian symbols with their destructive devices. By 1943, however, the tone shifted towards defiance, presenting the Christmas trees as challenges to German resolve that the people would overcome through unity and determination. Even Joseph Goebbels referenced the phenomenon in his speeches, turning the Pathfinder markers into symbols in the larger narrative of national suffering and eventual victory. The visibility of Pathfinder operations created unforeseen morale issues for German civil defense. Unlike earlier, more random bombing raids where civilians could convince themselves that their specific neighborhood might escape, the appearance of the Christmas trees removed all ambiguity. Once the colored markers appeared overhead, everyone in the vicinity knew, with certainty, that destruction was imminent and specifically targeted at their location. This psychological precision, the loss of hope that the bombers might strike elsewhere, proved as damaging as the physical destruction itself. Shelter discipline deteriorated as panic spread, with civilians fleeing toward areas not marked by the lights, instead of staying in the fortified shelters. The markers also revealed tactical information to German night fighter controllers. The markers' visibility from great distances allowed Luftwaffe ground stations to vector fighters toward the incoming raids before the bomber streams arrived. Controllers, observing the marker colors, could sometimes deduce British tactical intentions. A concentration of red markers suggested a precision strike on industrial targets, while mixed colors might indicate a broader bombing operation. The Luftwaffe learned to position fighters between the markers and the bomber streams, trying to intercept before the aircraft reached the protective formations of the main force. 4 Pathfinder crews circling above their own markers, the Christmas tree effect offered immediate feedback on marking accuracy. A tight concentration of predominantly red markers signified successful primary marker placement. Scattered colors across wide areas indicated navigation problems or disruption due to defenses. Bennett stressed during training that crews should study their markers from altitude, learning to judge their quality and adjust subsequent drops accordingly. Donald Bennett's relentless pursuit of improving pathfinding continued even as a Newhaven Method proved successful by late 1942 and into 1943. He identified a key flaw in the system. Once the Pathfinders had marked the target and departed for home, there was no authoritative figure remaining to assess the accuracy of the markings or issue corrections as conditions changed. Main force crews arrived to find whatever situation existed when they reached the target area, perhaps perfectly marked, perhaps obscured by smoke, or perhaps incorrectly marked due to navigation errors. Bennett envisioned something radical, an airborne commander circling the target throughout the operation, observing marking quality, directing backup crews via radio, and issuing real-time instructions to the bomber stream. This idea became operational reality on the night of August 3, 1943, during a raid on Hamburg. Group Captain John Serby flew as the first master bomber, orbiting the burning city in his Lancaster and directing the attack via continuous radio commentary. Serby's voice crackled through the headsets of the bomber stream. "Main force, this is Master Bomber. Red markers are accurate. Bomb the reds. I say again, bomb the red target indicators." This innovation transformed pathfinding from a pre-planned process into an adaptive form of battlefield control. Although it placed master bombers in extremely dangerous positions, the role demanded exceptional aimmanship and tactical judgment. The aircraft had to circle at medium altitude, typically between 12,000 and 15,000 feet, low enough to assess marking accuracy, but high enough to avoid collisions with the bomber stream. This altitude also put the master bomber within range of German light flak, which fired 37mm and 20mm shells in concentrated bursts around the marked targets. The master bomber had to remain over the target for the entire duration of the operation, often 30 to 40 minutes, while other crews completed a single pass and then departed. Each minute spent circling increased the risk of encountering fighters, flak, and the threat of collision as smoke diminished visibility. The radio procedure demanded discipline that sometimes contradicted survival instincts. Master bombers transmitted continuously or at regular intervals, providing constant guidance. Deputy Master Bomber, place greens 500 yards east of the reds. Main force approaching from the north. Your markers are dead ahead. This continuous transmission enabled German radio direction finders to track master bomber positions with high precision, directing fighters straight toward them. Bennett accepted this risk as operationally necessary, believing the master bomber's tactical value to the overall raid far outweighed the individual aircraft survival chances. The language used in master bomber operations was straightforward and efficient, focusing solely on real-time adjustments and providing clear directives to maximize bombing accuracy. Master bomber transmissions evolved into a specialized vocabulary designed for clarity under extreme pressure. Phrases were kept short and standardized. Reds are accurate meant to target the red markers directly. Overshoot the greens by 200 yards north provided offset guidance. Ignore yellows. They are decoys warned of German countermeasures. Cease bombing indicated when the markers were deemed inaccurate and attacks were to be halted. Crews were trained to recognize their designated master bomber's voice. Aware that German controllers occasionally broadcast false instructions to misdirect raids, the psychological burden on master bombers was immense and unique within Bomber Command. They were the only ones with a comprehensive view of how operations were unfolding, watching their markers either succeed or fail, observing the bomber stream's concentration or scattering, and seeing the fires either spread or fail to ignite. Group Captain Hamish Mahadi, who conducted several master bomber operations, described it as conducting an orchestra where every wrong note was visible as bombs fell on civilians. The moral weight of directing thousands of tons of bombs while circling above the destruction created psychological pressures that post-war analysis would recognize as distinct from normal combat trauma. Bennett, despite his command responsibilities, flew as a master bomber on several occasions, demonstrating the leadership philosophy he demanded from the Pathfinder Force, commanders who understood their systems from first-hand experience rather than theoretical study. His master bomber transmissions became legendary for their calm precision under fire, with his clipped Australian accent issuing corrections as his Lancaster shook through flak bursts. The innovation's effectiveness became measurable within months. Operations with master bombers saw improvements in marker concentration by 30 to 40% compared to raids using the standard Newhaven procedures. Photographic reconnaissance showed tighter damage patterns and a higher percentage of bombs falling within designated aiming areas. The human cost was also measurable. Master bomber losses averaged around 12% per operation, more than double the already high Pathfinder average. German intelligence officers analyzing Pathfinder techniques during the early months of 1943 realized they were facing an opponent whose tactical sophistication was advancing faster than they could develop countermeasures. Luftwaffe Night Fighter Ace Major Hadjo Herman delivered an uncomfortable assessment to High Command, warning that British marking accuracy was improving rapidly, and without effective counter-Pathfinder operations, German industrial production would suffer attrition that could not be offset by increased output. The countermeasures that emerged turned Pathfinder operations into a tactical chess match, with each new innovation prompting an immediate countermeasure within weeks. One of the simplest German tactics was the Schinnenlager dummy fire sites, controlled fire installations, wooden mock buildings, and even light arrays designed to mimic factory operations. When British bombers approached, German controllers would ignite these dummy sites exactly when Pathfinder markers appeared over the genuine targets, hoping to draw main force bombs toward empty fields. This tactic had some success, particularly against less experienced crews arriving late in bomber streams, when smoke obscured the real markers. Post-operation reconnaissance photos of raids on Essen sometimes reveal crater patterns in farmland up to 10 miles from the actual target, proof of the Schinnenlager tactic's effectiveness. A more sophisticated countermeasure was a German acquisition and use of identical British target indicators. Luftwaffe special units, particularly the Campfish 200 group, flew captured or reverse-engineered British markers, releasing them just after Pathfinder primaries appeared. The goal was to create confusion by scattering markers across a wide area, preventing main force crews from identifying the correct target. The psychological element was deliberate. Crews who could not trust the authenticity of markers face agonizing decisions, whether to bomb the questionable indicators or return with their loads. RAF intelligence uncovered this countermarking tactic through signals intercepts and prisoner interrogations in early 1944. Bennett's response showcased the adaptive nature of pathfinding warfare. He implemented rapid color code rotations, changing the tactical meaning of colors between operations in unpredictable patterns. For example, an operation on Monday might use red for primary targets and green for alternates, while a Wednesday raid would reverse the scheme. On Friday, yellows might be used for primaries and reds for decoys. Only crews briefed specifically for each operation knew the color code, and briefing security became intensely strict, with guards posted throughout and all notes collected afterward. The Germans adapted once more by deploying English-speaking radio operators to monitor master bomber transmissions and broadcast false instructions on identical frequencies. German controllers studied recordings of actual IAF master bombers, mimicking their speech patterns and tactical vocabulary. Main force, this is master bomber, markers are inaccurate. Return to secondary target at grid reference, the false transmissions often said. These efforts occasionally succeeded in misdirecting portions of bomber streams, although IAF countermeasures evolved quickly. Bennett introduced authentication codes that master bombers use in their transmissions. Specific phrases or numerical sequences changed with each operation. Crews received these authentication details during their final briefings with strict orders to ignore any radio instructions lacking the proper codes. German searchlight batteries developed specialized techniques for hunting pathfinders. Instead of using the traditional cone method to illuminate bombers for flak and fighters, Pathfinder hunting searchlights operated in a quartering pattern during the minutes before raids arrived. Their goal was to catch illuminators and primary markers during their critical marking runs, forcing evasive maneuvers that would reduce marking accuracy. Once a Pathfinder was caught in a searchlight, every available light within 5 miles would focus on the target, creating a defensive concentration that brought overwhelming flak fire. This tactic proved devastatingly effective. Illuminators and primary markers began suffering disproportionate losses compared to backers up, who arrived after the German searchlight batteries had exhausted their initial intensity. Bennett responded with tactical timing adjustments. Instead of illuminators arriving precisely 3 minutes before primary markers, timing windows became variable. Sometimes 2 minutes, sometimes 5, and occasionally, false illuminator runs by main force aircraft carrying photo flashes were made to exhaust the searchlight batteries before the real Pathfinders arrived. These variations forced German defenses into reactive positions, unable to concentrate resources due to the unpredictable timing of the Pathfinders. The technological arms race expanded to radio countermeasures. German Funstring units broadcast broad-spectrum noise on frequencies used for master bomber transmissions, attempting to jam the instructions before they reached the bomber stream. IAF special duty squadrons countered by using airborne transmitter aircraft to amplify the master bomber signals, creating redundancy through sheer signal strength that overcame jamming. The electronic warfare dimension added layers of complexity, where success depended on which side's technical advancements reached operational status first. Operation Gomorrah, the Allied code name for the destruction of Hamburg in late July and early August 1943, marked the definitive validation of pathfinding in its most morally complex achievement. The operation demonstrated how Bennett's marking techniques could concentrate bombing with such precision that it created self-sustaining firestorms, atmospheric phenomena where the bombing itself generated weather systems of apocalyptic intensity. Hamburg would burn in a way that transcended conventional military destruction, entering a realm where tactical success became a humanitarian catastrophe. The strategic logic behind Hamburg's selection was straightforward. Germany's second-largest city contained submarine construction yards, vital to the U-boat campaign choking Atlantic convoys, petroleum refineries that fueled the Wehrmacht, an industrial plant producing everything from optical equipment to aircraft components. Hamburg's location on the Elbe made it identifiable from long distances, even in poor visibility, giving pathfinders an advantage, as their marking accuracy would determine the success of the operation. On the night of July 24th, the Pathfinder Force executed Newhaven procedures with unprecedented precision. Illuminators arrived at exactly 23:57, the magnesium flares transforming the Elbe's distinctive curves into unmistakable navigation markers. Primary markers place their reds within 300 yards of the designated aiming point, a concentration tighter than any previous operation. Backers up maintained marker intensity throughout the 45-minute attack as 791 aircraft passed over the target area. Reconnaissance photographs from the following day showed extraordinary results. Over 70% of bombs fell within the marked zone, a concentration rate more than 3 times the Bomber Command average. The second Hamburg raid, on July 27th, exceeded expectations and entered uncharted territory. Weather conditions, low humidity, high temperatures, and strong surface winds, combined with precise marking to create conditions meteorologists would later classify as a firestorm. The phenomenon required specific preconditions, including sufficient fuel density, thermal concentration generating rapid air rise, and environmental factors that allowed feedback loops. Hamburg had all 3 once Pathfinder markers guided the bomber stream's bombs into optimal concentration. The mechanics of the firestorm were horrifyingly efficient. Initial incendiaries and high explosives ignited thousands of individual fires within the marked area. These fires consumed oxygen faster than it could be replaced, creating pressure differentials that pulled surrounding air inward at accelerating velocities. The incoming air fed the flames, increasing combustion rates, which boosted thermal rise, which intensified the pressure differential, which accelerated the inflows further. Within 2 hours, winds at ground level reached hurricane force. Witnesses reported winds exceeding 150 miles per hour. The firestorm pulled debris, people, and vehicles toward its burning core. Temperatures in the center exceeded 800 degrees Celsius, hot enough to ignite materials once thought fireproof, melt window glass, and cause asphalt streets to bubble and flow. The thermal column rose to 20,000 feet, visible to bomber crews still circling above. The firestorm generated its own weather system. Thunderheads formed from water vapor, released by combustion. Lightning flickered through the smoke column, and the rising air mass created surface winds that spread the fires outward in expanding circles. The human toll was catastrophic and immediate. Approximately 42,000 civilians died in the July 27th raid alone, more than the total civilian casualties Britain suffered from bombing throughout the entire war. Shelters turned into ovens, killing occupants through heat and carbon monoxide poisoning, even when their structural integrity remained intact. The firestorm's winds made escape impossible. Survivors described seeing people blown into the flames, like leaves caught in a gale. The Pathfinder markers that created this intense concentration had achieved their tactical goal with perfection that produced consequences far beyond the imaginations of those who dropped them. Bennett received reconnaissance photographs and damage reports with mixed feelings. The pathfinding techniques had proven themselves beyond doubt. Every tactical goal had been met with a precision that validated years of development. Yet the scale of destruction, particularly civilian casualties, troubled even those officers most committed to the strategic bombing doctrine. Air Chief Marshal Harris saw Hamburg as confirmation that concentrated bombing could break German industrial capacity and civilian morale at the same time. Churchill received casualty estimates with visible discomfort, though he authorized continued operations. The remaining raids on Hamburg through early August maintained Pathfinder precision, though none replicated the firestorm conditions. By the end of operations, Hamburg's housing capacity had been reduced by 75%, war production had dropped to approximately 50% of pre-raid levels, and nearly 1 million civilians had been evacuated. The contribution of the Pathfinder Force to these outcomes was undeniable. Without their precise marking, the bombing would have spread over a wider area, resulting in less concentration and reduced effectiveness. The grim reality of Pathfinder survival rates was unavoidable, and every volunteer understood it before accepting assignment. Standard Bomber Command crews faced roughly a 5% loss rate per operation, meaning completing a 30-operation tour left a 22% chance of survival. Pathfinder crews confronted an 8% loss rate per operation, with a tour requirement of 45 operations instead of 30. The compounded probability was starkly simple. Most Pathfinder aircrew would not survive their tours. The high casualty rate stemmed from pathfinding's fundamental tactical requirements. Pathfinders arrived first, flying predetermined approach routes that German intelligence often anticipated, entering defenses at full alertness instead of being degraded by earlier bombing. Primary markers made steady runs over targets, positioning target indicators with precision. There were no evasive maneuvers, no jinking, just level flight at a constant altitude and heading, while flak predictors calculated trajectories and anti-aircraft guns aimed at their targets. Those 30 seconds of straight flight, crucial for marking accuracy, were also the 30 seconds when German gunners had stable solutions and fighters had predictable intercept geometries. Master bombers faced even grimmer statistics. Their survival rate was about 65% per operation, meaning 1 in 3 failed to return. The role's requirements left little room for defensive options. Circling at medium altitude put them within the optimal range of flak. Continuous radio transmission provided direction-finding targets, and extended time over the target, sometimes up to 45 minutes, multiplied exposure to threats. Wing Commander Robert Palmer, who flew as a master bomber on numerous operations through 1944, was eventually killed over Cologne on December 23, 1944, during his 110th operation. Posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross for continuing to direct bombing despite his Lancaster being mortally damaged by flak, Palmer's death highlighted the sacrifice inherent in the role. The psychological burden of Pathfinder losses went beyond individual grief into collective trauma. Squadrons watched their most experienced crews, navigators who could dead-reckon positions within miles, bomb aimers who could place markers within yards, disappear with statistical regularity, making detachment impossible. 7th Squadron, one of the original Pathfinder units, lost 43 aircraft in 1943 alone. Each loss represented 7 highly trained specialists whose development had taken months of selection and training. Bennett's response to these casualties revealed both his leadership philosophy and its limitations. He insisted that Pathfinder standards must never drop, meaning replacement crews underwent the same rigorous selection process, regardless of operational pressures. This uncompromising stance preserved capability but created manpower shortages that sometimes left squadrons operating below full strength. Bennett himself flew operations regularly, with his personal log showing 26 Pathfinder sorties. He believed that commanders asking crews to accept 8% loss rates could not do so from the safety of a desk. The physical and emotional strain of such assignments was not lost on him, as he understood the sacrifice each crew member made. The experience of being shot down as a Pathfinder carried unique elements beyond standard bomber losses. Pathfinders, arriving first, often went down over targets before fires had spread, meaning crash sites were sometimes easily identifiable to German authorities. Luftwaffe intelligence services specifically targeted captured Pathfinder crews for interrogation, recognizing their knowledge of marking techniques, color codes, and navigation aids. The Gulag Luft Interrogation Center near Frankfurt had specialist sections for Pathfinder prisoners, where interrogators exploited the psychological trauma of recent shootdowns to extract technical intelligence. Squadron traditions developed around loss management, balancing commemoration with operational necessity. When crews failed to return, their personal effects were collected immediately. Photographs were turned face down in quarters, beds stripped and remade, names removed from duty rosters before surviving crews returned from debriefing. This clinical efficiency served as psychological protection, creating emotional distance that allowed operations to continue despite mounting grief. Memorial services were held in batches, typically monthly, honoring all recent losses at once rather than individual ceremonies that could create continuous mourning. The impact on crew morale was complex and contradictory. Some crews requested transfers from Pathfinders after witnessing the loss rates, accepting the social stigma and rank reduction that came with voluntary departure from elite status. Others developed fatalistic philosophies, viewing survival as a matter of probability beyond personal control, finding liberation in accepting likely death rather than fighting against statistical odds. Flight Lieutenant Donald Curtin, a primary marker pilot who survived 49 Pathfinder operations, later described a mindset as playing Russian roulette while maintaining professional detachment about the revolver. Bennett fought continuously with Bomber Command headquarters over tour lengths, arguing that 45 operations represented unreasonable expectations given loss rates. His proposals to reduce Pathfinder tours to 35 operations were repeatedly rejected on the grounds that reduced experience levels would degrade marking accuracy. The institutional logic was brutally pragmatic. Accept higher individual casualties to maintain collective effectiveness. The legacy of the Pathfinder Force extended far beyond 1945, embedding itself deeply into military doctrine with such thoroughness that modern precision warfare is fundamentally shaped by Bennett's innovations. The conceptual breakthrough that specialist forces could mark targets for following conventional forces using visual indicators to create shared tactical understanding, proved applicable across technological generations and combat environments that Bennett himself could never have imagined. The immediate post-war period saw Pathfinder techniques transferred almost intact into emerging Cold War aviation doctrine. The newly independent Royal Air Force retained Pathfinder squadrons into the late 1940s. Their roles evolved as jet propulsion and improved navigation aids reduced some original limitations. The United States Air Force, after studying Bomber Command's operational research extensively, incorporated Pathfinder concepts into strategic air command procedures. American doctrine adapted the color-coding principles for nuclear target marking, developing specialized radar-equipped aircraft to guide bomber streams towards Soviet industrial targets using Bennett's foundational methodology, translated into atomic-age requirements. The Korean War demonstrated Pathfinder relevance in tactical environments radically different from strategic bombing. When United Nations forces required close air support in mountainous terrain with limited visual references, forward air controllers functioned as ground-based Pathfinders, marking targets with colored smoke grenades that served identical purposes to Bennett's target indicators. The colors themselves often matched IAF specifications: red for primary targets, green for alternates, yellow for corrections. Pilots approaching targets through valleys and clouds relied on these markers exactly as Lancaster crews had relied on colored flares over Hamburg. The tactical geometry remained unchanged despite technological advancements. Vietnam brought pathfinding into jungle warfare, where visual target acquisition from altitude was often impossible through the dense triple canopy forest. The solution was reverse-engineered pathfinding. FAC aircraft orbiting at low altitude would mark targets with Willie Pete white phosphorus rockets and direct fighter bombers toward the smoke plumes. The radio procedures, "hit my smoke," became the standard instruction, echoing master bomber transmissions from 2 decades earlier. This adaptation demonstrated how Pathfinder principles functioned independently of specific technology, remaining valid wherever one force needed to guide another toward targets in contested, low-visibility environments. The Falklands War in 1982 featured perhaps the most direct descendant of Pathfinder techniques in modern combat. When IAF Vulcan bombers conducted the Black Buck raids against Port Stanley Airfield, flying from Ascension Island across nearly 4,000 miles, they employed Pathfinder methods immediately recognizable to Bennett. Lead aircraft marked the runway with flares, following bombers' aim for the illuminated zone, and the entire operation relied on precise timing and sequential marking, exactly as the Newhaven procedures had specified 40 years earlier. The revolution in laser-guided munitions during the 1970s and 80s represented pathfinding evolution rather than replacement. Forward observers and FAC aircraft now painted targets with laser designators, creating coded light signatures that guided bombs with extraordinary precision. The conceptual continuity with colored target indicators was direct. Both systems used light to communicate targeting information from specialists to delivery platforms. The color coding had simply become wavelength coding, with different laser frequencies serving identical functions to red, green, and yellow flares. But the underlying tactical architecture remained Bennett's innovation. Modern precision-guided munitions and GPS navigation have eliminated many original Pathfinder limitations. Yet, specialist marking forces persist across contemporary militaries. The United States Air Force maintained combat controllers and tactical air control party specialists whose missions are functionally identical to Pathfinder Force roles. Arrive first, identify targets, and coordinate following forces through real-time communication. Their equipment has progressed from pyrotechnic canisters to digital data links, but their operational purpose would be immediately recognizable to a primary marker navigator. Since 1943, the master bomber concept evolved into joint terminal attack controllers, aircraft or ground personnel who direct airstrikes through continuous observation and radio guidance. American JTAC procedures standardized across NATO forces employ terminology and radio discipline directly descended from Bennett's innovations, authentication protocols preventing false instructions, standard phrasing ensuring clarity under stress, and tactical judgment balancing precision with collateral concerns. All these trace their lineage to master bomber operations over Germany. Perhaps the most profound legacy of pathfinding lies in the professionalization of targeting itself. Bennett's insistence that target identification required specialist skills, dedicated training, and elite selection challenged the prevailing assumptions that any competent crew could find and attack objectives. Modern militaries now accept without question that targeting demands specialists, distinct from those who deliver ordnance, forward observers, intelligence analysts, strike coordinators. This organizational separation, now fundamental to combined arms doctrine, originated in Bennett's recognition that finding targets was as crucial as destroying them. The colored flags that once marked Hamburg and Cologne have disappeared into history, but the principles they embody continue to guide precision strikes across every modern battlefield.